Hello and welcome back to the second lesson in the LNAT Section A series. We'll be talking about facts versus opinion questions. This is one of the most common types of questions you can be asked in the LNAT, and it does trip a lot of people up. So let's get going. So in today's lesson, we'll be talking about methods to distinguish between what is a fact versus what is an opinion. All right, as I said, this is a very common type of question. All right, and people often get confused between facts and opinions. We'll start by looking at the possible types of question that you might be asked. The first type of question you might be asked is the writer takes the view that. Now this is a question that does ask you to distinguish between facts and opinion, as a view that the writer takes will be one of their opinions, as opposed to a fact. And so that is one crucial way in which you can eliminate options in this type of question. The second type of question is, according to the passage, which of the following is a fact? Now this is a simple formulation, which is asking you to distinguish between facts, which would be the right answer, and opinions, which would be the wrong answer. Note the question says, according to the passage. Now it says this because obviously we can't work out what's actually a fact or not, so we're going to have to go off what is suggested in the passage, or what's presented in the passage, as factual. The third type of question, this is very similar to the second, which of the following is an assertion of fact rather than opinion? So this is asking you exactly the same question. Don't be fooled by it saying assertion of fact. As I said before, that's just because we can't work out what's actually a fact, and so we have to work out what's asserted or presented in the text as factual. And finally, the most important fact which the reader seeks to convince the reader of is. So this question has two parts really. The first is to distinguish between fact and opinion, as we've done before. And the second is to distinguish between facts themselves. So there may be more than one answer option, which is a fact. And just the right answer will be the one which you deem is the most important, or which is presented in the most important way. So let's have a look at some key ways in which you can separate facts from opinions then. The first key thing to do is to look for evidence. So this is things like statistics, examples, observations, or things like that. Now, evidence indicates that something is factual in its nature as opposed to opinion-based, because the author is presenting reasons why it's true, and so it has an objective characteristic. The second thing to do on the other side is to look for emotive language. Things like, I think, or I argue, or this should be the case, or this cannot be the case. These are all indicative of opinions, because they show that the author is presenting an argument. They're not trying to present something as objective. Instead, they're saying that something should be the case, or might be the case, or things like that. However, it's not always that simple. So you should watch out for opinions which present themselves as facts. Sometimes a writer is trying to convince the reader of a point, and so will present their opinions in a way which looks factual. Let's take, for example, Ford is the best car in the world because it is the most affordable, durable, and spacious. Now this looks like it might be a fact. It looks as though it's backed up by evidence, and it doesn't really use any emotive language. However, it's still an opinion. Now, a crucial way to work out in these sorts of examples, these hard cases, whether something is a fact or an opinion, is to ask yourself the following question. Is the statement based on an assumption or an observation? Statements which are based on an assumption of the author are opinions, whereas statements based on observations are facts. Another way to phrase this is to think, could I verify this? I know you don't have access to the internet and the LNAT exam, but work out, if I did have access to the internet, would I be able to get a clear answer on whether this is true or not? If you can, then it's going to be of a factual nature. So, in the Ford example, could you get a clear answer that Ford is or isn't the best car because it is or isn't the most durable and spacious and affordable? You're not going to get a clear answer on that. There might be different perspectives and different arguments presented by maybe different car magazines. But it's clearly not a fact because it's not something that you can objectively verify on the internet. Let's try this out in a practice question. I want you to read the following question. It says, which of the following is an assertion of fact rather than opinion? So it's very simply asking you, which one is a fact, not an opinion. so 4 of them should be opinion-based. Note this is one of those questions where you don't actually need to refer to the passage. It's always a good idea to, if you have a passage in front of you in the exam, to check back and make sure that there's no context which might change your answer. But in this case, you can actually answer the question just by looking at the quotes themselves. So have a think, which of these quotes is phrased in a way which shows that it's a fact rather than an opinion? Now the answer is B, because it says, as Matthew Arnold noted. Now, think back to some of the things that we spoke about before. Is this backed up by any evidence? Well, not necessarily, but it is talking about a person, which adds an element of veracity to it. And the second thing, is there any emotive language? Well, there's not really. And the third thing, is there anything assumed by the author? Again, no. And finally, is it something that we could objectively verify on the internet if we were to look it up? And we could. We could maybe look up whether Matthew Arnold said this in a speech or a book or an article. And so it has the characteristic of a fact. If we look at some of the other options, literature cannot be divorced from life. This is quite similar to the example I gave earlier with the Ford cars. It looks like it might be a fact, and in fact, the author, in an attempt to persuade the reader, has presented it with some factual characteristics. By using the word cannot, he makes it as out as if it's obvious that literature cannot be divorced from life and that this is not an area for debate. However, clearly, if you were to use some of our tests, for example, the verifiability test, could you work out whether this is true or not? And the answer is no, you can't. And as a result, it's an opinion. The same is true of you cannot understand it. That's very similar in its nature. And therefore, if we can eliminate the other options for that reason, and we have good reason behind option B being correct, we can go ahead and select option B as the correct answer. Let's try this in a sample question now with the full passage. So I'd like you to pause the video here and read this article through carefully, and then we'll go through a question. If you've finished reading the article, we'll skip forward to the question. And the question is this: the writer takes the view that, and there's 5 options. I'd like you to have a quick read of these options. So pause the video here again and read through these options and come to an answer that you think is correct. If you've got an answer in mind, then that's good. If you don't, maybe try using some elimination. Maybe try and get rid of some options that we know aren't views that the writer takes. And so if you have your answer in your head, we'll go through the correct answer, which is D. So let's have a look at some of these options then. Option D and option E are fairly similar in some ways. Just option E is more specific. So option E says the patient should decide on treatment, whereas option D says, well, the important thing is who decides. So option D isn't suggesting that it should be the patient or the physician or anybody else that should decide. It's just saying that the important question in the debate which we're having today about this topic is that one, as to who should decide. A and B and even C, we could argue, are too general. And they're too general because they don't really attack the crucial part of the crucial point, I should say, of the passage. So we're left with option D, which says the most important issue is who decides. Now we can see that reflected if we go back to the passage. Now we can see this in the last paragraph. If we look at the last sentence, consequently, who is to decide has become more pressing than what is to be done. That shows that the author thinks the crucial question is who should decide. We can see in the rest of the passage different discussion of different parties and groups and bodies who might have a say and who might be more or less justified in deciding. However, all the author passes judgment on is that someone should decide, and that is the question we should be asking. Let's try this again in a second sample question. I'd like you to pause the video here again, read the passage very carefully, and then we'll go through to the question. So if you've finished reading the passage, we'll skip through to the question, which asks us which of the following, according to the passage, is a fact. So take a careful read through all of these options. Now you might notice some things about these options. For example, all of the options suggest either countries or statistics. Option A talks about China. Option B also talks about China and the US. Option C talks about EU countries. Option D, China, India, and other developing countries. And option E talks about 3.5 billion motor vehicles. This gives you a key link in each of the answer options. And that link will allow you to go back to the passage, find either the name of the country or the statistic that's been referenced, and refer that back to the question to work out if it's a fact or an opinion. So, with that in mind, we can use some elimination and get rid of some of these options. If you're struggling, then you can use elimination to get rid of some of these options. Also have a think about some of the word choices used. For example, in option C, it talks about the EU countries not meeting their Kyoto target. That's objective in its nature. It says factually the EU countries definitely will not meet their Kyoto target. So try and look at whether you think that's actually presented as factually true within the passage. Think about whether the author presents it as definitely going to happen or maybe unlikely to happen. And if they present it as unlikely to happen, then it's not being presented as a fact that it definitely will happen. So if you've got an answer in your head, then we'll go through to work out whether you were correct. The correct answer here is E. That 3.5 billion motor vehicles would, note that that's conditional, increase world oil consumption by about 70%. Let's have a look to the passage and see whether you agree. So if we find the answer that is actually correct, it's in the last paragraph, about halfway down. At current consumption rates, the estimate of 3.5 billion motor vehicles would increase world oil consumption by about 70%. Note that the author doesn't say that there will be 3.5 billion motor vehicles, or that it, could or definitely will. Note that word would is reflected here. If we had 3.5 billion motor vehicles, there would be an increase in world oil consumption by about 70%. Let's look at some of the answers that are wrong. Let's look at the EU countries meeting their Kyoto target. Note that the passage says it will be unlikely that the EU countries will meet their Kyoto target. The passage never says that it definitely will or won't happen. So when we see in the answer option an empirical nature, that it definitely will happen. They definitely will not meet their Kyoto target. That's not correct based on the passage. Let's look at the option that reflects China buying 4 million new cars as well. And we can see the same thing is true. Last year, the Chinese reportedly bought 4 million new cars. And this is a different phraseology to what the answer option says, where they say that they definitely did buy 4 million new cars. The same is true of the answer option which talks about China and the US and their relative car populations. It says that commentators suggest that the country's 1.3 billion people will have more than... The passage says that commentators suggest that the country's 1.3 billion people will have more cars than the US within 25 years, whereas the answer option says that it's definitely true. These are all options we can eliminate for those reasons. If we go through to the last sample question then, I'd like you to read this passage very carefully and pause the video here. And if you've finished reading the passage, then we'll go through to consider the questions. So the question here is, the most important fact which the writer seeks to convince the reader of is. Note here, we've got two reasons why an answer could be wrong. The first is that it's not a fact. And the second is that it's not the most important fact. So distinguishing between fact and opinion isn't the only thing that you have to ask yourself here. You also have to make sure that within the realm of fact, it is the most important fact. So have a look at these answer options. Note that some of them are quite similar. A talks about the truth of evolution, whilst B talks about the continuous nature of evolution. C talks about the wrongness of the absolutionist viewpoint, whereas D talks about the lack of moral discrimination in the absolutionist viewpoint. So A and B and C and D all talk about the same sort of thing. If you've got an answer in your head, we'll go through to discuss whether you're right. The correct answer here is B. We can see that A is too general and too simplistic. The writer simply does not talk about the truth of evolution enough for it to be a contentious point of discussion. C and D aren't the main point which the writer seeks to convince the reader of, and we can eliminate both of those at the same time due to the lack of discussion about the absolutionist viewpoint. Let's take a look at option E in the passage, the status of an intermediate human species. Now this is factual, but it's not the most important fact. We can see it referenced on line 4 of paragraph 2. To see this, imagine there's an intermediate species. It is therefore clear that this is given as an example to demonstrate the wider point, and therefore isn't the most important fact. It's not something the reader's trying to convince us of. Let's recap then. In these fact-opinion questions, it's very important to look for the language used by the author. Is it emotive language, or is it language that reflects evidence? If you're struggling, or if it's one of those trick questions, look at whether the answer can be proved by observation, or it's based on an assumption of the author of some kind. Make sure you read the answer options especially carefully in these types of questions, and relate them back to the evidence in the passage. Often, there will only be 1 or 2 words different between the option and the passage, but that's enough to show that the option is incorrect, as it is a fact rather than an opinion, or vice versa. These are questions where it's quite easy to trip up, and so attention to detail is crucial. However, if you keep the skills you've developed today in mind, you should do well on these types of questions. And that is lesson 2 complete. Well done, and I will see you next time.